What is going on at 145? Looking at the landscape of the featherweight division right now, I wanted to talk about the matches that are being booked between these featherweight contenders and essentially talk about what fights I think are good for the division and what fights I think are essentially pointless. What fights aren't pushing the division further at all, and the contenders I feel like are getting an unfair shot up the rankings. So, my first point on this would be this apparent rematch between our current champion Alexander Volkanovski and Yair Rodriguez. Um, I don't think this fight makes any sense at all. Yair, I don't believe has done anything to deserve a title shot. He's coming off of one win, and it was a win versus an unranked Bellator fighter making their debut. And I don't think that warrants a title shot against Volk, especially not a rematch where we saw Volk impose his will essentially on Yair Rodriguez in their first fight at UFC 290, and he was just out of his depth in that fight, in my opinion. Volk's only going to get older. It was great seeing him get his title back against Diego Lopez earlier this year at UFC 314. It was great to watch. Seeing a fan favorite like Volk get his belt back after going on a rough skid. Back-to-back knockout losses against Islam Makhachev and Ilya Topuria. But he's only getting older. He needs new matchups and he needs new styles. Not only would this sort of thinking benefit Volk as the champ, it would also benefit the UFC and the featherweight division as a whole, allowing these contenders to get their shot against arguably the greatest featherweight of all time in Volk. And I just don't think this is a good pay-per-view draw. I mean, from a fan standpoint or from a money-making standpoint, this doesn't make a lot of sense because a lot of people are going to be like, well, we've seen this before. We saw Alex Volkanovski fight Yair, and that's that. He got finished in the third round. He didn't look like he was championship caliber. And that's besides my point on Yair Rodriguez. I don't think he is UFC championship caliber. I don't. He has done a lot of things that allow me to not consider him as a genuine contender. People are forgetting that this guy literally ducked Zabit Magomed Sharipov and got cut for it. He is arguing with Diego Lopez at the 314 press conference, but refuses to fight him. He's not a true, anytime, anywhere kind of guy. He's not a number one contender. Someone like Movsar Evloev, someone like Diego Lopez, even John Silva, you can consider those guys like prospects for that number one spot because they're willing to fight anyone, anywhere, regardless, because they know that they're one of the best in the world and they're willing to prove it against anybody. Yair is not that kind of fighter. So I feel like this is mostly just a waste of time for the division because this is just wasting Alex Volkanovski's time where I love Volk, but I'm going to be honest here. He is on borrowed time. He's only going to have a couple more defenses left before he genuinely passes the curve on being able to maintain that championship level against his younger up and coming featherweight division. Volk is extremely skilled. He's one of the greatest of all time, but Father Time is undefeated. It will be a point in the next couple of years where Volk will be too old to be champ, to stay at that championship caliber. So I feel like making this fight wastes that time of someone who's genuinely should be fighting real contenders who have proven themselves, like Movsar Evloev. So I feel like this is mostly just a waste of time for the division, and I don't want to see this fight, and I know a lot of people don't want to see this fight. It just makes no sense. Moving on to this new matchup that will be the UFC No Chain main event, I believe in September. This is between Diego Lopez and John Silva. I won't lie, this fight does have banger potential. Diego Lopez and John Silva are two of the most gritty fighters in the division. They'll never say no to anybody. They're going to impose their will as much as they can, and they're going to leave it all in the octagon. This could be a fight of the year, potentially. And even though I don't necessarily like this fight being booked from Diego Lopez's perspective, I do see the upside to where this could bring a lot of attention to the featherweight division because Lopez is trying to maintain his spot at the top, basically saying, I'm that number 2 guy or number 3 guy for that title shot. I'll get the title shot in the next fight or the next 2 fights. And John Silva, everyone knows, is a surging contender. You know, getting those finish wins over. He submitted Bryce Mitchell. He knocked out Bagdasarian. You know, finishing these guys left and right. I don't hate this matchup, but it's just not a lot of upside for Lopez if he does win. You know, he's still a fight or two away from getting that title shot back. And, you know, John Silva's a fighting nerd. We all know how amazing the guys from that camp are, that gym are, you know. Him, Kyle Bajalio, Carlos Prates, and Rufi. Like, those guys are all really, really good. So I can see why the UFC is trying to push them to the top because they're really exciting and they have a lot of eyes on them. But I think this is the biggest test that Silva's seen yet. You know, guys like Bryce Mitchell, Bagdasarian. I'm blanking on who else he's fought. But I don't know. Guys like that, they're low level, lower level. Lopez is a dog, you know, and I think that this may be a little too much too soon for him. Am I excited for this fight? Absolutely. Do I see this going one of 2 ways? Yes. One way I can see this going is that Silva keeps his form and just dog walks Diego Lopez and just does whatever he wants. And then another part, which is a majority of what I think, is that Lopez being the bigger, rangier guy and also just having a chin of steel will just be able to, you know, use his head and be able to, outpoint John Silva and win a decision. And this just kind of proves that Lopez is really that anytime, anywhere kind of guy for the division. I remember seeing him, I believe it was a post on Instagram where he talked about how multiple contenders were brought to him and he said yes every time. Whether it was Yair, Mavsar, and obviously John Silva. But a lot of these contenders said no. And Diego Lopez is looking to show everyone that although he did lose to Alexander Volkanovski in decently dominant fashion, he's willing to prove that he belongs at the top of the division. And that's not something that we can say for Yair. You know, this is another reason why I think that the fight that should have been booked was Yair versus Diego Lopez. Not only because of the apparent beef between them that we saw at the UFC 314, but also because, I mean, that's literally the best number 1 contender match. I think that Volk should be fighting Evloev and Yair and Lopez fight for that next title shot. But, of course, the UFC has different plans, as they always do. In submission, I don't hate this fight. You know, it's actually really exciting. I'm really pumped to see this. It's just there isn't much benefit for Lopez, even if he does win. There was a lot of benefit for John Silva if he wins because a lot of people think he's the uncrowned champ. People think he's going to be champ. I think he could be champ as well. It's just there isn't a lot of benefit on Lopez's side compared to John Silva, who, if he wins this fight, he will be in that title picture. Confirmed. You know? But it's a great fight. I'm excited to see it. September something. It was booked September this year. So I'm excited to see it. It's a great fight. And next up, we're going to talk about another fight that I don't think makes a lot of sense, which is Movsar Evloev versus Aaron Pico. Like I said, this fight makes 0 sense. Movsar is the number 1 contender in this division. You know, the rankings still have, these guys at the top, and Mofsar has, beaten a lot of these really good guys. He beat Arnold Allen. He recently beat Aljamain Sterling in a pretty really competitive fight, and I don't really see the point in this. He doesn't need to fight Aaron Pico, an unranked Bellator fighter, again. You know, and this fight, I know this fight was only booked to make space for Yair versus Volk 2. I don't know why the UFC is like avoiding giving Mofsar the title shot. I can see a justification, kinda, being that, Mofsar is considered a boring fighter because he doesn't have any finishes in the UFC. He's kind of a decision merchant, which I understand, but it gets to a certain point where a fighter makes that statement with or without finishes. If they're beating everybody, they're undeniable for the title shot. We saw that for Bilal Muhammad. He was beating a lot of these guys and wasn't getting a lot of finishes, but he was definitely making his presence known that, hey, I'm the number one guy. You cannot deny me. It was the same thing for Merab Dvalishvili. He wasn't getting a whole ton of finishes, but he was undeniable for that title shot against Sean O'Malley, he was overlooked in favor of Chito Vera, which was a bit of favorable matchup on Sean O'Malley's part, wanting to get that get back for the apparent knee injury that he got in his first fight with Chito. But, you know, there are a bunch of contenders where even though their style isn't necessarily that finish heavy, you cannot deny them their rightful shot at that title. And it's not that Pico's not good. Pico is good. He's a very good fighter. He has a very strong wrestling base and he's extremely powerful. But frankly, he's a waste of Mofsar's time. Mofsar needs to be trying to get to that title as fast as he can. He's a young guy. He's undefeated, the undefeated Dagestani. He should be pushing for that title shot ASAP. And even if he beats Pico, it's still a waste of time. It's a waste of a camp. It's a waste of preparation for something he could be preparing for, which is that title. And I just don't think it's fair to him to have to fight someone untested in the UFC. To be honest, Aaron Pico could be fighting anybody. He should be fighting anybody else lower in the rankings. He could be fighting Lerone Murphy. He could be fighting Dan Ige, Sean Woodson. He should be fighting someone lower in the rankings, someone who, is having a rougher time getting up in those numbers. But the UFC wants to push these Bellator guys straight into the title picture. We saw that with Patricio Pitbull. We saw that regrettably with Patchy Mix, and the UFC is trying to get these guys or from other promotions, trying to get them into these rankings very quickly. But I think building some of these guys up is a much better idea because, there could be a repeat of the Patchy Mix fight with Mari Batista where he just wasn't UFC caliber when everyone thought he was. And that just kind of goes with my next point with, these Bellator guys may not be as UFC level as we previously thought. We thought with guys like Michael Chandler and Michael Venom Page that, these Bellator guys, they're really good. But I guess they're more of the exception and not the rule. These other MMA organizations, they're kind of known for having a weaker opposition. So a lot of these guys who are elite for that organization or that promotion, when they get to the UFC, they kind of look like fish out of water. Cough, cough, Patchy Mix. They look like they don't even belong there. So, this fight is a little bit disappointing from my perspective, being that Mofsar deserves the title shot. But, I'm not too mad at it because this could be, the great striker versus grappler matchup. Could see Aaron Pico pull off an upset, but I do mostly think that Mofsar is going to get it done, by decision, as always. But, it's a little bit disappointing, We could see that Volk versus Mofsar fight but the UFC wants to go a different path, which is it's whatever. I do think that Mofsar will beat Aaron Pico and beat whoever else is in his way to get that title shot. He's gonna be like Marab and Bilal, like I said, those guys who may not be the most exciting on paper, but end up beating everyone in their path and are basically undeniable for that title shot in due time. Moving on to the other featherweights in the division, I have not included all of them here because not all of them are booked, and some of them are not worth to be talked about, but they just haven't made waves yet, even though they are ranked. First, I'll talk about Lerone Murphy. He has an interesting rise. He's having an interesting rise. I don't necessarily like Lerone Murphy a lot because of his style and how he's just kind of like I kind of think of him almost like a featherweight Leon Edwards. Where he'll have moments in certain fights and he'll look really good, but he's essentially just a point fighter who throws throws very technically sound. He just throws very technically sound, but he doesn't really push himself to get to that finish. He has a very amazing backstory though. I just from a fan standpoint, I don't really like the whole style of I'm gonna throw that body kick, I'm gonna throw the jab, I'm gonna get out of his way. I'm not gonna push for that finish. I'm not gonna push to. I'm gonna take him down, but I'm not gonna push so hard for that sub or that ground and pound. Next up, we're gonna talk about Arnold Allen. I heard him and Lerone have maybe been, negotiating for getting booked, which would be exciting. But I'm just excited to see him return, if even if it is anything against Murphy, because he's been out for a minute. Pretty sure his last fight was against Giga Chikadze at 308, so it's been a couple of months, and I'm excited to see him come back. Maybe, because we don't know if they're going to get booked yet. Um, Moving on to Brian Ortega. Uh, this guy should not be a featherweight at all. He's currently booked against Aljamain Sterling for, I believe, the co-main of, I think it's, Jesus, might be Zhang Ming Yang and Johnny Walker. I think that might be the co-main for that. I could be wrong though. You know, Ortega should not be booked at featherweight anymore. He's expressed that he does not want to be a featherweight anymore. That making the weight has become a little bit too difficult for him, and he was really supposed to be booked the first time against Diego Lopez at 303, but literally was medically unfit to fight at featherweight. So the fight was scrubbed, and Danny stepped up on short notice famously and took that fight. But you know, Ortega's recently has been on a little bit of a downturn. We thought, since when he got that sub win against Yair, we thought that he was going to be back. But after that Lopez performance, when he got 30-27, or no, essentially 50-45, I think that was a 5-round fight. It just, I don't think it's safe. I don't think it's reasonable for him to be a featherweight anymore. And him taking this fight against Aljamain Sterling, I don't think is a great idea. Because even if he does make the weight and he does get in there, I don't believe he'll be able to do enough against Aljo. And talking about Aljo moving forward, he has looked good at featherweight ever since moving up. I believe his first fight at featherweight was against Calvin Kattar at 300. He looked really good in that. And I thought after that, when I was like, oh, okay, maybe he's going to get pushed up, since he's the bantamweight champ. But, you know, he's been kind of dealt a bad hand. And that recent loss to Mofsar kind of hindered his rise. And I just hope that, he can kind of turn things around and push himself to that title picture, because, his run at bantamweight is very underrated. You know, beating guys like TJ Dillashaw, Piotr Yan in that rematch, I believe. You know, he's very good. He's very good, very well rounded. and I just want him to get back in that win column and make waves in this division, in this new division of his. And speaking of division, just a little last point. I don't know why Ilya Topuria is still in the rankings. I'm pretty sure he's ranked at number 3 right now. He's literally fighting for a lightweight title in. I'm recording this audio on Friday night, June 27th. He's fighting for a lightweight title in less than 24 hours. In around 24 hours. Sorry, not less. He should not be in these rankings, and I hope that the UFC, whoever runs their technology, takes him out of the rankings and moves things around so we can see these featherweights actually be accurately represented in their division. And yeah, overall, I think, this is kind of rocky for featherweight. I hope that these fights turn out to be exciting because, on paper, not a lot of them look amazing. But I am hopeful that after these fights do, finish out, that these contenders can shuffle through and we'll see more title contenders, a different title picture in the next couple of months. So I am hoping good for good things. Appreciate you guys tuning in for this one. Like I said, this is Friday night, the 27th, right before UFC 317. If y'all want me to give my opinions after the pay-per-view comes through, I can do that. Y'all just let me know. But thanks for tuning in. Like, sub, all that stuff. Appreciate.